Excellent. So we will make a start. So good afternoon. My name is Ryan Dawson. I work within the IR35 team here at Kingsbridge. More specifically, what me and the team here do is everything in respects of IR35 status. That can range from very simple, straightforward sessions such as this one, giving an overview of what IR35 is and certainly what you can come to expect of IR35 as it changes moving forward, right the way up to actually defending limited company contractors against HMRC. This webinar today is going to be focused on you, the contractor. A lot of the sessions being put on are obviously focused on what end clients and agencies are doing in respect of IR35 changes. However, this session today is going to be focused on what you, the contractor, can expect from clients post-April and beyond into the new world of what we now know as off-payroll reform. The session is going to be roughly 1 hour in length. So I don't expect it to go over that 1 hour mark. It's certainly a great day outside. So I'm sure many of you will want to get outside into the weather at some point. But there is going to be a Q&A at the very end of this session. Comments and questions you can enter on the right hand side of the screen. We'll try to get through as many of those as possible at the end. But if there are any that we can't get through or any that you really want to get answered, then we'll leave an email address that you can forward those to us, and we can get back to you with those answers if we need to. There will be a recording of this session sent out afterwards. So if you do have to jump off at any point, or if you've joined late, then obviously you can go back and rewatch the session, which will contain the slides and obviously the recording of what we're saying. So to start then, I'm just going to cover off exactly what it is we expect you to get out of today. So we're going to cover off really what you can expect from your fee payers and also your end clients, both now and obviously beyond past April 6th, which is next Tuesday, and really what to expect now that IR35 liability and job of actually looking at status has moved away from you and into the hands of your end client and agency in your chain. We're going to also look at the dispute process for an SDS. So if you're unhappy with your IR35 status that's been given to you by your client, what does that process look like? What can you do to give yourself the best chance of certainly making a U-turn in that client's choice of status? And we're going to look to really cover off why you should not be worried necessarily about IR35 inquiries historically. So really why you should take some positive thoughts on those ones moving forward, but we'll also give you some different resources to kind of help you in your dialogue with your end client now, and some resources that will help you obviously look after your IR35 status historically whilst the actual liability is yours. So to start off then, just introduction to Kingsbridge, as I'm sure many of you will already know, but Kingsbridge is a specialist contractor insurance provider and an IR35 consultancy. We currently provide roughly 55,000 UK limited company contractors with their business insurance, such as PI, PL, EL. But we are now working with roughly 300 different agencies in the UK to provide a status determination tool. Now, that tool that we have is called the Kingsbridge status tool, and we are quite literally now providing status determinations and looking at status on behalf of thousands of end clients, both in the UK and overseas as well. The team here at Kingsbridge is headed up by Andy Vesey, who is somewhat of a IR35 celebrity, some might say, but he has personally defended successfully more than 550 IR35 inquiries, which is certainly an extremely high number to boast. But just to give you a bit of an idea as to what we're doing with agencies that will also help you with your status going forward, we're assisting agencies and their end clients by giving case-by-case assessments. We're providing them with an integrated disagreement process to handle disputes that you might have about status with your end clients, and we're really giving that end client and that supply chain the best opportunity to get IR35 right. As far as we're aware, it's the only tool which is a hybrid combination of both an automated process and experts here at Kingsbridge. And one thing that we're really pushing on is making sure that our clients and our partners have the relevant training and knowledge on IR35 necessary to go through this process as we go beyond April. It's really important that we pass on that knowledge because ultimately we expect agencies and end clients to get this right when assessing your IR35 status. So the first thing that we're going to look at then is the current rule set. So the rule set for IR35 right now, we're going to just take a very brief look at kind of what that supply chain might look like. But currently, right now, in the private sector, the rules for IR35 are found within Chapter 8, Part 2 of the Income Tax Earnings and Pensions Act, or the ITEPA. And right now, the rules are that you as the contractor have the responsibility to determine your own IR35 status for each contract that you are on. And with that decision, you as the contractor are also going to be responsible for the relevant taxes and making those payments to HMRC. So you can see on the right hand side here what a typical supply chain might look like. You'll have your end user client at the very top. You then might have your recruitment agency in the middle. You'll then have your personal service company, which for this example we'll assume is your own limited company. And obviously there is you, the worker, at the very bottom of the chain. So currently in the private sector, it is your personal service company's job, or your job, to assess your IR35 status for each and every engagement that you have. And typically speaking, most contractors nowadays will take some kind of care to actually do that, and they'll most likely have their status looked at or assessed by an IR35 expert. Now that might be some companies out there, such as the likes of Kingsbridge, that can provide that for you. But in essence, there are two things that you are going to be looking at and considering when having a look at your own IR35 status. The first half is your contract. So you're going to be looking at the contractual terms to see whether or not they are compliant in respects of IR35. The second half of that process is looking at your working practices. So looking actually day to day, what you're doing, how you're doing it, and is what you're doing compliant. Those are the two elements that are really going to make up your IR35 status, and they're certainly the two elements that I would encourage you to kind of have a firm grip on in terms of what you've been doing so far up until this point. Now, the reason we're all talking about IR35, of course, in this manner, is because new rules are going to be implemented next Tuesday, April the 6th, that will effectively transfer the responsibility of assessing IR35 status away from you, the contractor, and instead placing that responsibility now in the hands of your end user client. So in the private sector, it will be medium and large size private sector end clients who are going to be the party in the chain responsible for looking at the contractor's IR35 status for each engagement that contractor has with them. Now, whilst we've also got the transferring of the job of actually looking at status, what we now have is the actual transfer of tax liability. So the tax liability will no longer sit with you as the contractor. Instead, it's going to sit with your fee payer in the chain, and it's the fee payer in the chain that's going to be deducting the taxes relevant and paying those to HMRC. Now, on the right hand side, once again, you can see what that similar supply chain might kind of look like now. You have your end user client at the very top of the chain, who's going to be the party responsible for looking at your IR35 status. You've then now got the fee payer in the chain, which is going to be the recruitment agency beneath them. Then you've obviously got your PSC and the worker at the very bottom of this chain. Now you can see there at the very top, the end client's now responsible for status. And if there is an agency in the chain, they will be the fee payer. And it's the fee payer that's going to be responsible for the tax liability. Now, your end client must also pass that status down the supply chain via a status determination statement, which we'll come on to in just a little bit. We'll cover off kind of what that has to include and what that might look like. Now, very important to mention at this point that there are clients who are going to be exempt from applying these new rules. And these clients are what are going to be classified as small clients. So small clients, for the purposes of IR35, do not have to apply these new rules coming in. Instead, where you have a small client or where you are contracting with a small client, instead, you as the contractor will be the party in the chain responsible for looking at your own IR35 status. So basically, the rules as they are right now will continue where you have a client that is small. Now, HMRC have taken the definition from the Companies Act in respect of whether or not a client is medium or large or small, and that is found more specifically at sections 382 within the Companies Act. Essentially, if your client does not actually satisfy any 2 of these 3 criteria, then they will be classified as a medium or large size company, or in reverse, if they do not exceed any of these 2 of the 3, they'll be a small company. So a company with a turnover of no more than 10.2 million, a company with a balance sheet total of not more than 5.1 million, a company with less than 50 employees. So if your end client exceeds any 2 of those 3, they'll be medium or large size. If they do not exceed any 2 of those 3, then they'll be a small company. And as we've just covered, where your end client is a small company, the current rule set for IR35 will apply, and it will be you that will continue to look at your own IR35 status, and you'll continue to be responsible for the tax liability in those engagements only. So that then presented a bit of a problem for everybody, because naturally what started to happen and what people sort of, I guess, tended to assume was that end clients might not be willing to disclose their size in the hope that IR35 somewhat goes away. Well, what HMRC have introduced is now the duty for the client in your chain to confirm their size upon request. So if you, the worker, or your agency in the chain have any doubts over the size of the end client, if you have just simply, wanting the client to simply confirm that it isn't you looking at status and instead it's going to be the end client looking at it, then you can make that request formally to the client. If you make that request to the client has 45 days to come back to you, and the client will have to state their size and whether or not it's going to be you or the end client looking at IR35 status. Certainly from a contractor's point of view, I would encourage you to reach out to your clients at the very beginning of the engagements and just ask them to confirm their size regardless. What that will do is give you clarity over exactly who's going to be looking at status, and it will just give you the indication of whether or not you have to do anything at all, or whether you're just simply going to be relying on your end client to provide all the information to you about status. So what are you likely to expect from clients now going forward? So I think here at Kingsbridge, certainly speaking from our experience so far when dealing with end clients and agencies in respect of IR35, most end clients are going to be using a indicative role-based assessment to give an indication of status when they are advertising the job. So many of you have probably already seen adverts for contracts spanning either through or after April 6th, and they'll usually come with something that will explain the IR35 status kind of before you've actually gone and applied or kind of sent your business portfolio to them. It will say something like this role is inside or outside of IR35, or that it's an indicative outcome only, but most clients are going to be basing that role-based assessment on how they think or anticipate the role's going to actually operate in the day-to-day reality. Now that's absolutely fine. Clients can do that. It can be a good exercise or a good indicator as to what the status might be, but do just bear in mind that that will not then account for all of the facts of your engagement. For example, if a client's conducting a role-based assessment, they will not be able to test whether you are in business on your own account. So it's very important that you recognise that that is not the final status, that is not your given IR35 status, and it's only there to be used as an indication of what the status might be. If you've got any doubts about status, or if you want to sort of question exactly how the client sees status in that respect at that point, then you can always discuss status with your client before your engagement starts. And that's what I'd certainly encourage you to do, is definitely talk with your client, talk with your recruitment agency about status, make sure that everybody's clear and on the same page about what that might look like prior to the engagement starting. But certainly this is likely to become the norm. We're likely to see clients now advertising the status of a role based on a role-based outcome of how they think the engagement's going to look. And as we say, that's absolutely fine for the client to do. But from your perspective, do just remember that that is an indication of status only. It's not your final status. So what does the client actually have to do? Well, we're going to cover off just a couple of the, I guess, more important features of what the client must do in looking at your IR35 status. And we're going to start by just explaining that the client now obviously has to make a decision about IR35 status. Now, this is often going to be the most difficult part of the process for an end client. Most end clients have had nothing to do with employment status, certainly since IR35's introduction in 2000. Most end clients, it's fair to say, have not really had any interaction with it. Rightly or wrongly, that has been the case. Now end clients are suddenly having to deal with quite complex case law and quite complex circumstances and apply them to your engagements. So most end clients nowadays will be engaging with an IR35 specialist such as Kingsbridge. I used that example just a bit earlier on. We are quite literally working with thousands of end clients in the UK and abroad to help them assess the status for your engagements. And again, it's absolutely fine for an end client to do that. However, the end client does ultimately remain responsible for the actual status that you're given. Now, some end clients will be using the HMRC SES tool. I don't need to really talk about the HMRC's SES tool failings. They are well documented just about everywhere, but some end clients will be using it. It's very, very important to just recognise that there is no right or wrong way in actually assessing IR35 status in terms of what tool they use, what business they partner with, etc. But what's very, very important is that the end client must take reasonable care when looking at your IR35 status. Now, reasonable care is not a new principle when looking at case law, but in terms of HMRC's own guidance, their own publications, it is a relatively new concept for them, in that they're now saying that end clients must take a degree of reasonable care. And that test of reasonable care is very, very subjective, because HMRC have admitted themselves that they are going to be expecting a higher degree of reasonable care taken with larger multinational companies than they are with smaller companies with less resource to kind of pile into that process. But if you wanted to get an idea as to what HMRC are expecting of end clients in the supply chain now, what you can do is take a look at their guidance. Their guidance is found within the Employment Status Manual. I've put it in the bracket there. If you simply Google ESM 10014, that should come up, and it's roughly a 10-minute read, but that will give you an indication as to what your end client must do and exactly what HMRC are expecting of them when looking at your IR35 status. Now, what the client must also do is when they've made a choice over your status, if they've taken reasonable care, etc., then they must then pass that decision down the supply chain via a status determination statement, or an SDS as it's going to be known. Now, the SDS, for it to be valid, must include both your IR35 status, so whether or not you are going to be inside or outside of IR35, but it must also contain the reasons for coming to that conclusion. So it's no good the client just simply saying you're inside of IR35, case closed. The client must also give a reason, and a detailed reason as to why that's the case. Very important to remember that whilst the client does have hurdles to jump over, they do actually have an incentive to get this right if they have an agency in the chain, because if they have an agency in the chain, then the agency will become the fee payer and responsible for the tax liability. And if the client gets this right and discharges all of their responsibilities, the client is passing that responsibility of the taxes over to the fee payer. So clients do have an incentive to get this right, but if they do not get it right, then that burden of being the fee payer, that burden of holding the tax liability, will transfer back to the client if the client does not get this right. So the client does have an incentive, so there's no reason why the client should at least get this wrong. Just to run over an example of what an SDS might look like. Now, this is on the screen here, a mock SDS that I've pulled from the Kingsbridge status tool. I'm sure that some of you have probably had something similar if your agencies or end clients are using our tool. But the SDS should contain enough detail so that you understand status and you understand exactly why you've been given the status that you have. And you can see here at the very top, you'll have the details of the engagement, the company name, the assessment date, and then just beneath that you'll have the outcome of status, so exactly what the status is, inside or outside of IR35. But then all of the bullet points below in this example are all of the reasons why this SDS is saying you are outside of IR35. So there should be enough information on this page, enough information for you to really digest exactly why your status is the way it is, and it will give you an informed view as to exactly what your client is saying about IR35 status. Now, very, very important to mention at this point that your SDS, once issued to you, is going to give you really an option. It's the option of, am I happy with it? Do I accept it? Am I okay with the status that I've been issued? Is there anything that I can perhaps challenge or anything I don't understand? And what you should be looking to do with those questions is really getting them back to the client. And you can do that really in two ways. So the first way we're going to look at is the kind of formal route of the client-led disagreement process. Now, what the introduction of these rules does is introduce a burden now for the client to react to challenges of IR35 status. What the client must have in place is a process for you, the contractor, or indeed your agency, to go back to the client and challenge the document that they've been given. So if at any point you believe that the status is incorrect, or if you believe that any of the information provided, perhaps around the working practices of the engagement, or maybe even in the contract, are conflicting with what the client's saying, then the end client must have a process in place to deal with that. You can challenge that status with the client directly if you disagree with it. And the end client in your chain will then have 45 days to respond to you. So that 45-day window will begin on the moment that you submit the dispute, not at the moment that the SDS is issued. So you could, in theory, challenge the SDS right at the very end of your engagement, or likewise anywhere in between or at the beginning of the engagement. Obviously, you can go through and challenge that SDS. Now, what the client then will issue you in response is effectively their review of your challenge, but their response must contain reasons for either keeping status the same, so why they're issuing you with the same SDS and why they believe there is no difference in the original versus what they're now issuing, or they must give you the reasons for concluding that the original SDS was incorrect and issue you with a brand new status, updating it with what's changed and all the relevant information. So just as before, you should get a view or have sight of the information about status that is changed. And as I say there, the client has to respond to you within 45 days. If the client does not respond within 45 days, then the end client will assume the fee payer responsibility for the taxes due. Therefore, again, there is an incentive for the client to get this right. And certainly speaking on kind of behalf of Kingsbridge, there's no reason why a client should leave these anywhere near that 45-day window, unless there are circumstances that would mean that they are either extremely busy or simply cannot come back to you within a sort of very quick turnaround. But you should expect to have those challenges dealt with and handled inside of that 45-day window. Now, it's important that when you are challenging status or when you are considering status of your own, you need to understand exactly how IR35 status is made up and exactly what determines it. Now, there is no kind of rule book as such that says this is what an employee looks like, etc. But employment status is really made up entirely out of case law. The most important case historically is the case of ready-mix concrete, which I'm sure some of you will be familiar with if you've had your I-35 status assessed previously, because that case actually gives what we term today as the trinity of status tests used to determine whether or not somebody is an employee or indeed self-employed. Now, those three key status tests that we apply are the test of control, the test of personal service, which includes the right to provide a substitute, and the test which HMRC somewhat glaze over, which is the test of mutuality of obligation. Now, really speaking in terms of a contractor, you should have a lack of those three things in your engagement for you to be, concretely sort of standing outside of IR35. So a lack of control from the client over what you're doing, how you're doing it, where you're doing it, a lack of personal service, so your business is being engaged, not you as an individual, and a lack of obligation between the parties. So there really should not be an obligation for the client to provide you with work, and there should not be an obligation for you to accept that work if given. Now, those are your three key status tests. They're the three that really you should put the most focus on. They're the three that, you know, between either you and your client, you should be focusing your conversations on those three tests. But there are also multiple minor status tests that must be considered when making up your IR35 status. Just to kind of list off a couple of these, because there are a much longer list, but three of the more important are financial risk. So looking at whether or not you're actually exposed to any financial risk by opening up the engagement. You know, things like holding business insurance, for example, are a good indicator of that, because it you know, shows that your business is actually taking a financial risk and engaging with that client. The provision of own equipment. So where reasonable, do you provide your own equipment, or does the client provide it to you? And the final one I'm going to mention here is integration, or the lack of integration when obviously talking about a contractor. It should be fairly easy to somebody who comes on site that, you know, you are a contractor, you are not an employee, and there is a distinct difference in how those two channels of workers are actually treated. You know, something as simple as having something like a lanyard on that says contractor can go quite a long way in actually making it fairly clear that indeed you are a contractor and not an employee of the end client. So although it's important to ensure that the key status tests are positive and that they are in your favour, it's very, very important not to underestimate the minor status tests, because they will have an impact on your status, albeit not as influential as the more important three, but they will have an impact. And in some cases, some instances, it will be the minor status test that will swing your status one way or the other. So what do we expect will happen? What do we here at Kingsbridge internally think will happen? Well, whilst we would all like to sit here and obviously talk about the clients that are doing the right thing, we can't ignore the fact that there are clients out there who will not be doing the right thing. Some clients already have decided that the best route forward for them is to blanket ban contractors. So what we mean there is, you know, end clients are no longer going to be engaging with contractors at all. So if you're a personal service company or a limited company contractor, some of you on this session might have already been you know, having these choices given to them by their end client of, you know, that they're not going to engage with limited company contractors, and therefore they're going to move you over to a PAYE model. Now that PAYE model might be a umbrella company. Of course, umbrella companies more or less at the moment are having quite a hard time of it, some rightly so, but for some contractors and for some end clients, that is a good option. Now, blanket banning contractors is going to be a business decision by the end client. And if they blanket ban contractors, i.e. they do not engage with you as a limited company contractor, there effectively is no IR35 status to assess. IR35 does not apply, and therefore there is no risk whatsoever to the entire supply chain. That, in my opinion, is not the best way to deal with this reform. There are certainly clients out there that are really leading the way in that respect, but for those clients that do blanket ban contractors, some will have good reason for it, others will just simply see it as a risk averse way of making sure that there is no risk. We've already seen some end clients blanket inside IR35 assess their workforce. Now, clients cannot do this. They cannot blanket inside IR35 an entire workforce. What HMRC will say is that that is not taking reasonable care, because the client has a burden to actually assess all of your IR35 individual cases on a case-by-case basis, looking at the circumstances that apply to you. So if a client is obviously saying that everybody's caught, you know, one sweeping brush kind of move, that would not be taking reasonable care, that would not be looking at the status correctly, and that is certainly one thing that I'm sure HMRC will be quite quick in the future to try and actually clamp down on. But we can't move away from the fact that it is happening. it might still continue to happen, and it's just something that obviously you as the contractor should be aware of. But outside of that, there are a lot of end clients, and I would say the vast majority of end clients that are taking a much more pragmatic kind of, more holistic view on how they're looking at IR35 status. Many end clients and agencies are engaging with IR35 specialists such as Kingsbridge to help them do that on their behalf and help them to correctly assess IR35 status. And certainly what we expect is that in the kind of medium to long term future, more clients will become comfortable managing IR35 status, because they will begin to understand the risk in a lot more detail. This, for a lot of end clients, is brand new. It's something that which they haven't really dealt with at all, and most end clients that are taking these choices of blanket banning contractors or moving contractors to PAYE models are doing so because they do not understand or want to be associated with the risk. So companies such as Kingsbridge are trying to educate the industry as much as we can so that they can understand that risk and begin to take on more contractors in the future. And this will ultimately lead to contractors being assessed fairly going forward, and that's certainly what we are aiming for. We are aiming for contractors to be fairly assessed both now, but then in the future we want more end clients to obviously take that option up of fairly assessing contractors. Now, what can you do as the contractor then? This is certainly looking really at what you can expect to happen and how you can perhaps deal with those issues that may arise. So you as the contractor should be looking to have well-informed conversations with your client and or your agency about IR35 status. And that's really going to start at the point that you either have a role or see a role that you wish to perhaps go and apply for, or when you have work that you wish to kind of bid for. These are all the kind of first steps in your engagement. And just to kind of add to that process, having that conversation with your client, discussing what the status of the engagement is, perhaps ironing out any issues with what the status might be, is certainly the first step that you can take in respect of talking to your client about status. When you're doing that, I would always advise that put yourself in the client's shoes and try to understand both their method of assessing IR35 status. So are they working with an IR35 specialist? Do they have an internal team dealing with it? Are they just simply somewhat guessing at status? Try to understand exactly what they're doing and try to understand their view on IR35 status. And the core of this this message there is what you need from both yourself and the client is both of you to be honest about status. There's no point in the client trying to make an engagement look as though it's inside of IR35 because they don't want the risk, just as much as there is no point you saying, well, it's outside just because you want that engagement to be outside of IR35. You should both be honest with each other in respects of status, and companies such as Kingsbridge, where we are involved in that process, can certainly hold the hand of the entire supply chain and guide you in the right direction in terms of how that status is actually being born right from the very beginning, right to the very end when you're issued with your SDS. And if you can, try to have that conversation with your client before the engagement starts. So do not try and leave it to perhaps that first month where you might get that kind of first payment from the agency or end client. Don't try and bring up status then. Try and get those issues sorted before the engagement starts, because it will certainly help with any negotiations that you have to have with the client prior to the engagement starting. Now, when you're obviously having these conversations, it is best for you to be armed with as much information as possible. So you may wish to just consider having your own IR35 status looked at or assessed independently, to give yourself confidence about what the status is before you go to actually discuss it with your client. Now, there's plenty of options available here for you to go and do that. There are numerous companies in the private sector that can help you with that. Kingsbridge is just one of those, so by all means you're more than welcome to come to Kingsbridge, and we can help you look at both your contract and your working practices so that you understand what your status is. But again, it's very, very important that you are honest with the facts about your own status, because that will give you the best opportunity to then go back to the client and start to negotiate on what the IR35 status of a particular engagement is. You are best when doing that to obviously demonstrate your IR35 status by gathering evidence, and this can be in the format of a number of different things. So this could be over a period of time. You might have, got some evidence from your clients if it's a current engagement where you're perhaps using your own equipment, or where perhaps you are exercising your right to provide a substitute, or perhaps you just simply want to use the evidence that's in the contract in terms of the written terms. All of this information is really going to be valuable to you as the contractor, because you can use it to go back to your client, talk to them about status, and demonstrate that you truly are compliant in respect of IR35. And what the client should then be willing to do is, be engaged with you and have that conversation with you where you're, really giving them an argument that's credible. What clients are going to be least likely to kind of react to, and what clients are certainly going to be least likely to kind of engage in, is where you're just simply making a kind of last minute plea to them about status, where you don't provide that evidence. If you can go to a client, provide them with enough information, evidence to the contrary about status, they should be willing to engage with you in a conversation about it. And that will give you the best opportunity that you can, or certainly the best chance of having the client understand how you see status, and likewise coming to a compromise on what the status actually is. Now, having that conversation might lead to the end client giving you that outside of IR35 outcome, which is what you want. That's ultimately where you want to be. So whilst you're going quite a long way with the client to discuss exactly how the engagement can change, or perhaps how the engagement can operate to be compliant in respects of IR35, you've also got to consider the worst case scenario, where if you are found inside of IR35, have you considered your options? And these are all questions on the screen here that you're going to have to ask yourself, or some that even the client might ask you. So have you considered the option of working via an umbrella company if found inside of IR35? Or would you perhaps look to talk to the client, and would the client be willing to perhaps agree a higher day rate to cover off the difference of what the take-home pay might be? Would taking up employment with the client perhaps be an option? Or would you simply reject the offer and seek opportunities elsewhere? All of them are very important questions. They're very important questions, and probably some ultimatums in there that you've already had, this close to April 6th. But it's very, very important that, you should recognise exactly what the client's saying in respect of status, understand their position, and then counter their position if found inside of IR35 with genuine, credible evidence to suggest that you are outside of IR35. It's not all doom and gloom with these changes, because certainly what we're seeing from our perspective, speaking with everybody in the supply chain, is that it does present a really good opportunity for you as the contractor to start having a closer relationship with your end clients, and indeed with your agencies as well. Now, what that'll give you the chance of doing is, if the client, understands and trusts you in respect of status, and if likewise you trust them in respect of status, that will only lead to a better working relationship between both of your businesses, both the client and you, having that closer relationship. We're already seeing some clients come to us and explain the benefits of doing that, because projects are simply moving much more efficiently, that they've actually ironed out those issues and there is no complications over what the actual status is. But it also helps you with negotiations with contracts. Having that close relationship with clients will help you in the future, because if you ever start either going back to that client, if you have any contract renewals with a client, it will strengthen your position with the client going forward. Now, what we're also going to cover here is a bit of information around what HMRC are telling us, or certainly what the guidance from HMRC is in respects of your IR35 status historically. So I think we would have all had the concern, I think certainly most contractors will have the concern that whilst this change in who's looking at status is being introduced, it will give HMRC a lot of new information or new data that will allow them to see exactly what you're earning, what you're paying in tax, etc., etc., for many engagements. And contractors rightly should carry some concerns there, because they are not necessarily aware of what HMRC's compliance activity might look like. Well, on the 19th of January this year, HMRC published a contractor information fact sheet, where they've basically stated a few bits of information to give confidence to contractors and indeed the industry around what that compliance activity might look like. Now, what you see on screen here is a direct copy from that document. However, I will kindly ask the guys down in Tewkesbury who are actually running the session to post a link to that fact guidance sheet in the comments section on the right. So you can go and have a look at the entire document for yourself. There is some good guidance in there. But what HMRC are basically saying is that they will not open a new compliance inquiry into a contractor's return for tax years before April 6th in circumstances where your client has decided that a contract is within IR35, so you're inside of IR35. If you as the contractor change the way that you work from providing and invoicing services through a intermediary, so that would be your limited company, to now being paid via a client or end user payroll, so that's where you've obviously switched from being a limited company contractor to a umbrella company contractor, or perhaps you're just on the books of the end client, or in a circumstance where a contractor ends a contract because you disagree with a client choice on status. Now, these are all reasons that HMRC will not go back and look at your status, and it's very important. And I'm being honest, I think that HMRC will genuinely not use that information to go back and look at your status, and they've certainly given out the circumstances in which they will not do that, but they have not said that they will not go back and look at status in the past, because after all, IR35 status can only be looked at or assessed historically by HMRC. It wouldn't be worth their while to simply open up inquiries before any contract starts. So whilst it's important that you recognise that actually, don't be concerned about this information, don't be concerned about perhaps having a change in status, do not necessarily be concerned about your client just having a different view on status for what is in some cases the same contract that you're on now going forward, because HMRC are kind of trying to give clarity and saying, look, those circumstances we're not going to go back and look at your status. But as I mentioned, it does not mean that they will not, because after all, HMRC do have the duty of actually enforcing IR35, obviously historically, and whilst the liability is yours, HMRC can still go back and obviously look at contracts in the past. But what they're saying is they're obviously not going to use this information as an excuse to. Now, just to give a bit more confidence, I guess, in kind of what HMRC are saying, and as I say, I personally do believe them when they say this. They've actually, said quite publicly there that they've never opened a IR35 compliance inquiry into a contractor's status before April 6th, 2017, when obviously the public sector reform happened, using the information that they gathered at the 2017 reform. So in other words, they're basically confirming that they've never used any information gathered to go back and look at contractor status. And I would definitely, read the kind of fine print, or at least read kind of between the lines in that. The information here is key. They're not using the information, but it doesn't mean that they're not going to go back and look at status, randomly or simply by going through their compliance activity as they would normally. So contractors have the option of buying insurances from companies out on the market. Obviously, Kingsbridge is one such provider of business insurance that can protect contractors and their own limited companies from any kind of IR35 inquiry. But the Kingsbridge product is slightly different in that it will cover both you as the contractor, so where you work with perhaps small companies or clients in the future where the liability will be yours. Then in that circumstance, the insurance will cover you as the contractor. But what our insurance also does is cover the end client and your fee payer in your supply chain if you are working for a client that is medium or large size. And that cover will provide you with £100,000 worth of tax, interest and penalties, and also £100,000 worth of defence costs. Now, the product itself comes with full protection for the length of actual liability. And what we mean by that is the policy has a 1-year live policy period, so it's an annual term product, but it comes with a 4-year claim reporting period. So what that means is if you are on contract for a year, you then cease contracting, you'll then also have the benefit of 4 years beyond that, basically, where you can then come to us and actually, give that claim to us that you've got from HMRC. That's obviously important because HMRC can naturally look back 4 years when looking at back at IR35 status. It's underwritten by one of the world's leading insurers, so the household name of Zurich Insurance. That does give a lot of confidence to contractors and end clients that engage with Kingsbridge, because having such a big name against the insurance, and it's really giving that confidence that actually it's a big insurer behind it. It's not a unknown insurer that you're going to worry about not paying out in the event of a claim, but instead it's a big name with an excellent claims record historically speaking, so that should give you confidence in terms of the actual product itself. But the actual policy is actually defended, so the chosen IR35 defence on the policy is our own head of tax, which is Mr. Andrew Vesey, which you mentioned at the very beginning of this call. So not only have we got one of the best products on the market to cover both you and your entire supply chain going forward, but we've also got the I would call leading IR35 expert in the UK, particularly in terms of defence, actually defending this product as well. So what we'll do, conscious of time at the moment, I did want to leave a bit of a chunk here at the end for any questions that you might have. So what I'll do, I'll just give that a moment or two. You can enter questions on the right hand side in the comments section. I'll give you sort of 2 minutes or so to do that, and then we'll work through some questions before we finish and conclude the session. So we'll give you just a moment to pop any more questions in the right hand side there. Okay, I can see there's quite a few questions coming through, so we'll try and get through as many of these as possible. Any that we can't obviously get through, we will try to issue responses with the recording of the session as well. So the first question that I've got here from a bit earlier on in the session is what happens if a client refuses to issue an SDS, making just a blanket decision? So a couple of things to cover off in this answer, I guess. Firstly, the client must issue you with an SDS. That is the one certainty that I can tell you. The client will have to provide you with a status determination statement. Now, there is no kind of documented format that must come in, so it might come via email, it might come via post. You know, these things are all to be sort of made by the client, but when it does come to you, it must conclude the reason for the actual status, so whether or not it's inside or outside of IR35, and then it must give you the reasons for that. You know, it should document the kind of details as to what the status is, and it should be pretty clear to you to obviously do that. The client can't just simply make a blanket decision and say that everybody's inside or that everybody's outside, because obviously what HMRC will then you know, be more interested in is whether or not the client's taken reasonable care in coming to that conclusion. So it's very, very important that the client that you have discharges their responsibility. The client therefore must issue you with status and conclude quite firmly what the reasons are for actually coming to that conclusion. So I hope that one's given you a bit of an answer to that one there. So the next question is, will it be possible to change the IR35 status of an ongoing engagement? And this is a really good question. I probably should have covered this actually. IR35 status is not something that's going to be set in stone on April 6th. So whilst pretty much all of you on this call will be getting your IR35 SDSs either already or being given them this week, next week, etc. That status that you get on April 6th will not necessarily be the one that you have at the end of the engagement. It is absolutely possible for you to change the status of the engagement. That might happen by accident. It's something which is termed as scope creep, whereby your engagement might begin as perfectly compliant outside of IR35, but then perhaps over time you decide, well, actually, you know, some of these working practices have changed. Maybe the way that I operate now is different to how I was at the beginning. So your client might then have to reassess status. And in fact, your client does have an obligation to reassess status if there are any material changes in the way that the engagement's operating. So don't necessarily be discouraged with the first status that you get. It can be changed. It can be changed either voluntarily by having a chat with the client, discussing status with them, discussing status at length with the client, and possibly working out different ways that you can actually improve the IR35 status of any engagement. But it also can happen involuntary. So that might happen, as I say, with something such as scope creep, whereby your status is perhaps changing because of the way that you and your end client are operating. So certainly don't be you know, downbeat if that does happen, but you know, just be aware that status can change. It doesn't necessarily you know, have to kind of be the case that what you get at the outset is what your status will finish like. So just to go through a couple more questions then. This next question is from Chris. So does working on multiple clients on overlapping projects go to prove that you are not a disguised employee, or will each contract need to be looked at? Again, very, very important question, this one. Your IR35 status is unique to the contract, not to you as an individual. So when we're talking about status, when we're looking at IR35 status, it's very important to just remember that it is not going to be you, the person, that is being looked at. You know, they're not going to be looking at you in respects of IR35 status. They're going to be looking at your engagement. So each of your contracts either with the same client or different end clients, will be assessed on their own merit, depending on how the engagement is going to operate. Now, if you as the contractor have multiple contracts in operation at any one point, either with the same or different end clients, then that is a positive indicator. That is a positive indicator that you are operating a genuine business on your own account, because you've basically got multiple streams of income. You know, your business is operating with multiple clients at any one time. So that will absolutely help you. And certainly if your client does not understand that you have multiple clients, then do obviously make them aware of it, because it can have an influence on obviously how they see status based upon some of those minor status tests as well. So very good question. Yeah, absolutely. It can have an influence, and if your client doesn't already know that you have multiple end clients, then do obviously just make them aware of it for that process of obviously getting your SDS. So the next question is from Dennis, and the question is, how does it work with overseas clients, particularly from Switzerland or EU? So overseas clients is a relatively straightforward issue to kind of resolve, in that these rules coming in on April 6th, next Tuesday, will only impact those clients who have a permanent UK establishment. So if you have an end client who is entirely overseas, if your end client is entirely overseas from the UK, has no UK office, no UK operation, etc., then the rules that are coming in will not impact that end client. And what will happen in those circumstances is you as the contractor will continue to be responsible for your own IR35 status. So whilst the end client's overseas, basically, you will be responsible for your own status. You will be responsible for the taxes with the current rule set applying to that engagement. Now, if you have an overseas end client, and that overseas end client does have a UK office, or it has a UK arm or branch within its organisations or parent company structure, then as far as IR35 is concerned, that end client will need to apply the rules. So the rules coming in on April 6th will need to be applied by your client if they have that UK permanent office or any UK arm to their structure. The end client will then need to go and look at status. What I would do in certainly if you've got a client that's overseas, and if you have any doubts as to whether they are overseas or not, is use that example that we posted earlier about asking the client to confirm whether or not they are a small or medium-sized business, because what that will force the client to do is tell you whether or not you or the end client is going to be responsible for looking at status. So it is a good way of getting some clarity from the end client when obviously talking about status and who's going to be looking at that status with them. Just another question here. I think this might be the last one. I'll try and get through it fairly quickly. But the question is, roughly, what is the cost of Kingsbridge looking at my IR35 status? Very easy on this one. If you were to come to Kingsbridge and you wanted us to look at both either your working practices or your contract, then the cost would just be £50. And we can go through that with you. We can handhold you through that process, talk you through the answers if needs be, and really give you some good information and ultimately clarity over what your status is that you can use to go back to your client and try to convince them that they've got it wrong, if they have got it wrong, of course. So yeah, we can absolutely do that. There's been a couple questions I can see about the slides and a recording of the session. And yes, absolutely. The session itself is been recorded, and a recording will be sent out to you via email, I imagine, shortly afterwards. So yep, you will all get that with the slides attached to it as well. And I think what we'll do there, conscious of time, is wrap up this session. I can see there are absolutely loads of questions, and I will endeavour to try and get back to as many of those as possible. But if any of you do have any questions at all beyond this session, you can obviously email them to us at IR35 at kingsbridge.co.uk. It's the one that you see at the bottom of the screen there. But for now, I'd like to thank you all very much for joining us today on this session. Obviously, the reform is only a week away, so it's a good opportunity to try and look at your own IR35 status in a bit more detail before that happens. And certainly where Kingsbridge can help you with that, certainly where Kingsbridge can look to assist you in actually looking at your status or challenging your status with an end client, then do obviously feel free to get in touch with us, and we are more than happy to obviously help you do that. Thank you very much for joining us today, and we'll hopefully look forward to speaking to you very soon.